What's up, everyone? How are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Deku story. What if Deku in a female world harem? If you enjoy, then please like, share, and do comments. Izuku Midoriya was walking to his home from his job at a local cafe. He was working while going to college, and he had a vague memory of someone asking him for help. He'd readily agreed and had signed some paperwork allowing him to join up with a program called the Interspecies Cultural Exchange Program, or ICEP. He yawned as he thought about the strange agent who'd asked him to be a member of the program. She was a 20-something-year-old woman with long black hair, sunglasses, brown eyes, a black business suit, and heels. She'd practically begged him to join the program when he was called a local hero. He agreed readily enough when he found out the girl he'd be hosting wouldn't be able to stay in Japan if they couldn't find her a home. The girl had said she was really interested in Japan, and Izuku couldn't see denying someone the chance to enjoy his home country when he could help. He stretched as he cleared his mind and approached his two-story home. It used to be one story, but the ICEP's construction company had remodeled it with his permission. He knew his guest would be arriving in a day or two, so he was planning on cleaning up and preparing for their arrival. Kuroko Smith, as the woman was named, had told him she'd let him know when she was bringing the girl over. She also asked if he'd have a problem with more girls possibly arriving as time went on. He said as long as he had at least a month to prepare himself, he'd be fine with it. He didn't see the devious gleam in Smith's eyes, nor did he catch her maniacal giggles while he served her the coffee she ordered. If he had, he probably wouldn't have changed his response, but he would have been weary. As he walked through his front door and headed to his kitchen, his cell phone rang. He smiled when he saw it was his mom and said, "Hey, Mom. How goes everything? Your Mamano guest settling in fine." Inko, Izuku's mother, said of course she's settling in. She's helping out around the house and everything. She still worries about you since she was interested in getting to know you. When are you going to visit? Izuku chuckled and she said, "I'm serious, Izuku. Also, other than her being worried about you, everything's going great. Anyway, you have anything new going on since you moved out to Tokyo?" Izuku chuckled and said, "Well, you know I've got a house. I've joined the ICEP. I don't know the girl I'm going to be having move in with me, but I know that she should be arriving in a day or two. They also expanded my house. I think I heard my coordinator talking about possibly buying the lots around me for expansion depending on the number of people who join my household. You sure you and your house guest don't want to leave your apartment and move in with me?" Inko chuckled and said, "Izuku, you know I'm content in Mustafu. I know you think I'd like it in Tokyo, but I'm content. My house guest may move in with you after she becomes a citizen, but that's only because she feels like she knows you from my stories." Izuku blushed, knowing at least a few of those stories were from when he was a kid and obsessed with superheroes and anime. Inko giggled and said, "Your silence is telling, Izuku. You're worried about what she'll think about you after knowing your childhood. Don't worry, I kept most of the embarrassing things to myself. Of course, if you want her to know everything, I can tell her." Izuku blushed deeper and said, No, I believe you, Mom. No need to embarrass me when I'm not around." Inko laughed and said something about that removing all the fun. He sighed and said, "You brought up the embarrassing photos because I keep asking you to move in with me, didn't you?" She laughed and agreed, making him sigh and say, "All right, Mom, I'll stop asking. You know I worry, though, but since you have your house guest, I have nothing to worry about, I guess." Inko said, "Exactly, Izuku. I'll be fine without you here, and you'll be fine without me looking over your shoulder. Anyway, I'll let you go. I love you. Talk to you later." He replied, "Love you too, later, Mom," before hanging up and putting his phone on the kitchen table while he made himself some dinner. He ate slowly as he relaxed after a long day at the cafe. His eyes closed a few times, and he popped his back to get the kinks out. He yawned and muttered, "Man, am I tired. At least I have the weekend off to settle my homestay." He yawned and stretched, then popped his neck and headed upstairs to take a shower. He turned on the water and started the shower as he looked at himself in the mirror. His hair was an odd green and black. His eyes were green. He was muscular from community service projects, and he had a few scars on his arms and hands from fighting the local gangs. Despite being a gangbuster, he was actually a pacifistic person, had a strong moral compass, and wanted to help everyone get better. Izuku woke up to his alarm going off at 7, got up, brushed his teeth, pulled on a t-shirt and shorts, and rinsed his mouth out. He pulled on his red high tops and socks, then headed downstairs to start on breakfast. He worked on coffee first as he had a feeling Smith would be over long before she brought his house guest. He was right on the money as his door opened, and Smith entered humming. He turned to her and asked, 2 sugars, milk, and cream Smith. She nodded happily, and he slid her a cup of coffee, then poured himself a cup and sipped it after adding a healthy amount of cream and sugar. He couldn't really stand bitter stuff, thus he wasn't much of a coffee fan until he'd started working at the cafe. Now he couldn't live without the dark brew. Smith sighed in contentment and asked, "Everything all right, Izuku?" He nodded and she said, "You sure? I don't have to go over the rules of home stays. I don't have to remind you that unless you get permission from your coordinator, there can be no hanky-panky, no intimate contact beyond hugs, and definitely no harming of Mamano girls or them harming humans. Do I?" He shook his head, thinking, "Of course you already reminded me of all that just now." She smirked and said, "You're no fun. I know you read the rules, but I expected a young male such as you to definitely want to jump into the sack with a hot Mamano girl." Izuku snorted, not willing to say he'd almost lost his virginity to the Mamano staying at his mother's house as little as 3 months ago. He stretched his arms, which flexed his muscles, then yawned and shook his head. He said, "Smith, I know the rules. The fact the government allows the girls to have it all, mainly depending on if their race requires it, like succubi and the occasional Titania or fairy queen, is so surprising. Then again, maybe it has to do with the fact that humans born from human and monster couples are starting to develop abilities, and that some people who mate with Mamano are also starting to have abilities, or the occasional girl becoming a Mamano from being infused with their mana, and living with them if they aren't past their prime child-bearing years." As he said that, he thought about his mother who'd looked younger when he was around her. Then he thought about his neighbor who became what the Mamano called an alp, or male turned into a female monster because they truly wished to be female before being infused with the magical energy of Mamano living with them. He'd been surprised, and yet not when his neighbor turned into an alp, because he had expected him to change in some way. After all, the man had shamelessly flirted with Izuku and the other guys on the block. He'd also been considering getting transgender surgery, which Izuku and told him he'd support wholeheartedly if that was what his neighbor wanted. Then the neighbor got a succubus tenant, and a month later he became an alp. The two were now like sisters, and the alp girl was still hitting on Izuku from time to time, while the succubus was constantly flirting with him. Not that the dumb-ass Izuku could realize that. He was rather dense when it wasn't obvious, like his mother's tenant coming out and asking him to mate with her. Smith sighed and said, "I guess you're no fun to tease then. You're probably a dense motherfucker if you haven't realized that your neighbor wants to bone you." Izuku blinked and said, "The two of them are just really friendly." Smith sighed and thought, case in point. I'll have to find some way to get under his skin before we add too many girls. Not that I don't see this adorkable bunny cinnamon roll getting boned the moment I give the girls the okay. I think I'll make them wait a few months, that way I can see how he handles the full moon and how they react to him over time. Plus, they say competition is good for the soul. I don't think I'll give any of the girls he is going to live with the go-ahead until there is at least 3 living here. Then let my entertainment begin. Also, the Moan girls already have a thing for him from him bringing them lunch when he found out I was overworking them, or so they claimed. Izuku studied Smith and said, "You're plotting something to get back at me for siding with your subordinates." She smiled as if to say, "Who, me, never." He snorted and said, "I don't believe that look for a second, Smith. Kuroko, I don't trust you at all. I have the feeling you'll use me to the best of your ability to make your own life easier. Then, when I'm worn out, back off. Until I am healed, then push me even further as you figure my limits have increased." She blinked, surprised someone so naive had pegged her so well upon only knowing her for 2 weeks. She smirked and started to say something when he said, "Before you speak. Yes, I have been observing you, but that was also based on how your subordinates talk about you, and just my own understanding of people." She sighed and said, "Damn, Izuku, I didn't expect you to say such a thing. Ah, well, I guess I'll just have to prove I'm worth keeping around." He snorted and she smirked. He yawned and she said, "Not get enough sleep last night, Izuku?" He glared and she said, "I'll take that as a no." Yawning again, he glanced at the paperwork she had for him. He saw his new tenant's name was Ryuko Tatsuma. a dragon with white scales, gold eyes, and the ability to revert to her monstrous form. She also had blonde hair and wore a cheongsam or Chinese dress. He looked at Kuroko and asked, "Smith, why is my first homestay a dragon?" She just grinned and he sighed, saying it couldn't be some other type of creature. It had to be the proud and sometimes arrogant dragons you are throwing me to first. She merely smirked at him and he sighed, then said, "When will she be arriving?" Smith looked at her watch and then held up 10 fingers. He asked, 10 hours. She smirked and said, "No, 10, make that 9 minutes." Swore and resisted the urge to strangle her. She smiled and said, "I love the fire in your eyes when you're pissed at me." He held back the urge to scream and she said, "Now Izukun, your house is up to your new tenant's standards. Of course, if it wasn't for remodeling, she'd think you were pathetic. She is also bringing her hoard." He stared at her aghast and she said, "It was her choice, not ours, hence why you have a basement." He nodded slowly and sighed. Smith giggled and said, "Should we go wait outside?" He nodded and said, "Yeah, I guess we should wait for Miss Ryuko outside." Smith wondered how Izuku would react when there were 2 Ryukos and an additional 2 girls besides. She giggled evilly to herself, and Izuku said, "What's got you so excited?" She merely smiled and he said, "You really get on my nerves at times, Smith." She smirked and he sighed, then walked outside. Smith watched him go and muttered, "Oh, his reactions are priceless. I guess I'd better join him. I wonder if Ryuko, or her nickname Ryukyu, is going to give Zuko a hard time while she's here, or if he'll earn her respect easily. Especially as he's such a good little errand boy for Moan when we need his help. Then again, she is dragon royalty, so I don't think she'll be willing to let him go easily." After talking to herself, she walked outside and leaned on the porch railing waiting for Ryuko's drop-off. Izuku turned to her and she said, "Give it a few minutes." He nodded and stretched, then leaned on the porch railing. His house was a 2-story with wide hallways. A balcony at each room upstairs was painted slate gray with blue trim, and the porch was a wraparound. Suddenly, a van pulled up and Izuku asked, "That her?" Smith nodded and he hopped off the porch, then walked up to the van as the back was opened. Out walked a white-scaled dragon girl with blonde hair covering her right eye, gold eyes, sharp teeth, and her tail flicking behind her. She was wearing a cheongsam and studying Izuku intently. He held out a hand, saying, "Hello there, I'm your homestay host Izuku. You must be Ryuko. Nice to meet you." She growled and stuck up her nose at him, making him blink and raise an eyebrow. She snorted and looked at Smith as if to ask, "This scrawny fucker's my host." He saw her expression and said, "Just because I'm not the biggest of guys doesn't mean I'm weak, Ryuko." She snorted out a laugh. He glared and she smirked challengingly, saying, "Oh, pansy boy thinks he can stand up to a dragon." He growled and she said, "How you're so easy to tease, kid." He glared and she smirked at him even more challengingly, daring him to attack her. He sighed and muttered something about not worth it, making her glare and say, "Weak little man says what?" He just stared at her, smirking slightly, and she said, "I guess you're scared." He snorted and said, "Nope, it's just not worth going to jail to assuage your ego and beat you up." Ryuko growled threateningly, and he said, "Roar, I'm a big scary dragon, but I can't hurt anyone without a reason or in self-defense. I also can't help but be a big baby over a human not falling for my bait." Ryuko lunged at him and he caught her fist. She glared and he said, "Get it out of your system or we're going to have hell living together." She smirked, liking his spine, and he said, "You know, I'd swear you're a tsundere." She blinked and looked at Smith, asking, "What exactly is a tsundere?" Smith giggled and motioned for her to come over. Ryuko walked over and Smith whispered in her ear the definition of a tsundere. Smith smirked as Ryuko shouted, "I am not in love with you and in denial about it. I didn't even know you." Izuku laughed at her overblown reaction, and Smith fell over from how hard she was giggling. Ryuko glared and said, "I don't know you, so why would I be in love with you?" Izuku shrugged and said, "I just said I'd swear you're a tsundere with how you like me challenging you, but I've been wrong before. Anyway, let's go inside." She nodded, growling, and he led the 2 inside, then sat down at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Ryuko looked around the living room and he said, "You can go pick any room except the master bedroom. I really don't want to share my room when we've just met." She glared as if he'd insulted her mother and took her bag upstairs. Izuku chuckled and said, "God, she reminds me of Kachan's mother Mitsuki. Feisty and dangerous. I guess I'm lucky I like playing with fire." Smith said, "Just be sure you're not burned Zyukun. I would hate to deport royalty for roasting you. Also, have you thought about my offer to join Moan?" Izuku nodded and she said, still not up for it. He shook his head and she asked, why not? He smirked and sipped his coffee, silently making her pout. She glared and said, this is why she has a problem with you, Zukun. You seem so smug today. He laughed and said, I'm not smug. Just because I feel confident today and don't want to tell you why I won't join Moan doesn't mean I'm smug. She snorted as if to say, yeah, right. He chuckled and said, I'm sorry if I'm bothering you, Kuroko. You know you can leave at any time. I think I can handle Miss Broody Pants upstairs by myself. She snorted. He chuckled and she sighed as if wondering what to do with him. He laughed and she said, I don't know why you're so cheery. You're the one who has to appease an angry dragon, and don't forget she's royalty. That shut him up, but he just smirked as if to say he could handle it. Smith sighed and muttered, lots of smirking is going on today, it seems, especially between you and Ryuko. Izuku laughed at that, and she said, I'm serious, Izuku. You two haven't stopped smirking since she arrived, especially when you pulled one over on each other. He raised an eyebrow and asked, what do you mean by pulled one over on each other? She sighed and said, I mean like you catching her fist, or her getting under your skin by calling you weak when anyone who looks at you can see you work out. He blinked, surprised that she noticed, and she said, your arms are very toned, Izukun. Your legs also fit tightly into your pants and your stomach is toned. Your shirt is tight enough to see that. He looked down and realized that she was in fact right. His shirt did show his muscles. It didn't help it was one of his workout shirts. He chuckled sheepishly and scratched his neck. She giggled and said, you honestly didn't realize, so you weren't going for macho to intimidate the dragon lady. He shook his head and she said, huh, amazing. You pulled off alpha male looks and attitude unintentionally. Where'd you learn to be like that? He blushed and said, I just put on the same act as my childhood friend. Speaking of his mom should be in the system, her home stay was a salamander girl who was 5 when she arrived. She saw Ka-chan as a little brother. We were 4 when we met her. Her mom was also a home stay at the time in the same house. She was the one who convinced my mom to take in a home stay, which is why I'm so used to Mamano and get along with Moan so well. She snorted and said, it helps your house husband material wrapped in a buff package. He looked at himself and said, I'm house husband material. She nodded and he said, really? She nodded yet again and he said, no way. She smirked and he said, what would make the Moan girls think I'm house husband material? She held up 3 fingers and said, first, you volunteered to take care of our laundry when you saw we were overworked. Second, you usually make lunch for all the girls. Finally, third, you constantly sew up Zambina, take care of Doppel, cheer up Tianitia, calm down Manako about her eye, and make me coffee every time I come over. Can you see why we think of you as our house husband? Izuku stared, wondering if he really did all that. She smirked and said, speaking of, you still have the girls' laundry in a basket in your laundry room. He thought about it and realized that yes, he did in fact have the Moan girls' clothes in his laundry room waiting for Smith to take it home. He sighed and asked, you still plan on forcing me to be a Moan operative at some point, don't you? She nodded and he said, even if it's just as the chore boy. Another nod, then Tatsuma Ryuko walked into the kitchen. He waved at her and said, hungry. She nodded, watching him warily. He chuckled and said, just cause we got off on the wrong foot doesn't mean I won't be a good host. That said, what are you after exactly? She shrugged and said, I could go for some lunch. He nodded and got up, then opened the fridge and motioned for her to pick a food she'd like to have made for lunch. She walked over and said, how about the pork cutlets? He grinned and she said, what? He said, nothing, I'm just happy you picked the pork because I make a mean katsudon. She smiled slightly and sat at the table, happy he wasn't smiling at her slight lack of knowledge about his fridge's contents. She didn't think he was that petty, but she'd been proven wrong before. She hummed as she watched him bread the cutlets, then start frying them. She hummed in pleasure at the smell, making Kuroko chuckle. She glanced at her, and Smith just shook her head at the dragon girl, then sighed and GT up. Izuku asked, if you're heading to your office, take your coworker's laundry with you. She winced and said, fine, however you owe me more coffee for this. He snorted and she said, what? He said, I always owe you coffee. I have even started buying good brands from work in order to make sure you get your fix. If I didn't supply you with coffee, whether it be from my home or work, you'd never get off of my couch. She grinned and gave him a thumbs up, saying, damn right, Zukun. Anyway, I'll get the girls' laundry and load it in my car. Unless you can really quick take a break from cooking to get it for me. He shook his head, not turning away from the food, and she sighed, muttering was worth a shot. She turned to Ryuko and said, behave, dragon girl, no giving into your lust. Ryuko glared as if to say she wasn't her feral cousins. Kuroko said, I know you're not a feral dragon, but you have a feral form. I also know he's one hunky piece of man meat. Thus I wouldn't be surprised if you fell for him and wanted him to breed you like a werewolf bitch in heat. Ryuko snorted and looked away as if saying that would never happen. Smith smirked and said, oh, I don't think you should be so sure about that. Also, you're going to have another home stay in 2 months. Izuku growled and said, 2 months? Smith, usually it's a year between home stays. Why the hell am I getting 2 months apart? Smith said, this girl has just recently joined the system and is looking to get away from her tribe. He glared at her over his shoulder, making her shudder, and that was panty wetting. I better not let Kayama anywhere near him. If I did, she'd push his buttons till he either took her or kicked her out for good. It's bad enough my Moan squad has crushes on him. We don't need agents falling for him too, or else we're screwed because he's just the right mix of hot and cute. Damn it, I need to get him out of my head. He's only 19. Wait, I'm only 25. Why the fuck should I hold back? Oh, right, because I want to load all sorts of mamano onto him in order to get a raise. Also not wise to fall for the clients. He studied her and said, what's wrong, Kuroko? She smiled innocently and shrugged, then walked out of the room to grab Moan's clothes. He sighed and finished cooking, his mouth watering, and said, hope you're ready to eat, Lady Ryukyu. The dragon in question blinked and wondered why he called her a lady after being so confrontational this morning. He set her food down, then sat down with his own plate and dug in. As he and Ryuko ate, they both contemplated life going forward. They knew that so long as Izuku did nothing illegal and Ryuko did nothing to get deported, they were stuck together for the foreseeable future, which neither found to be a bad thing. Izuku thought Ryuko was spunky, and Ryuko was happy he had a backbone of some kind. They kept glancing at each other and looking at their food when their eyes met. After a few minutes of this, Izuku sighed and said, I guess we need to decide how we're going to do things going forward. I'm not your servant, I'm not a pushover, and honestly, you aren't the first homestay I've dealt with, though the first was my mom's guest, not mine. So do you have any dietary needs? Also, is there anything in particular you would like on Sundays, as I'll be making that the day you can pick what we eat outside your dietary restrictions, and we could even eat out on that day. He stretched and finished eating, then put his plate in the sink while waiting for her response. He was happy he could say he wasn't a pushover compared to when he was only 14. When he was 14, his mom's homestay moved in and her, along with Kachan's sorta older sister, sorta homestay Samantha Flair, helped him break out of his shell and start standing up for himself after 10 years of keeping quiet, sitting back, taking whatever was thrown at him, and getting into losing fights with bullies to protect other kids. He always wanted to be a hero, which hadn't changed, but the world of fiction was the only place he could see himself becoming a hero just yet, unless he worked for Moan, but he refused to be Smith's errand boy. He shook his head and listened as Ryuko started talking. Ryuko said, I can tell you're not a pushover. I also am not looking for a servant. If I was, I'd have never left the palace. As for dietary needs, I require meat to be healthy. My sharp teeth aren't just for show. Though protein of any kind can work, meat and fish tend to fill most of my dietary needs. As for special occasions, I occasionally like sweets. Izuku nodded at that, figuring it went beyond one world to the next for girls to have a love of sweets. Hell, as far as he could tell, it was multiversal, as the Mamano home world was a universe away. He stretched, and she said, anything else you'd like to know? He hummed in thought, then asked, do you want to apply for a job license? She thought about it, then shook her head, and he asked, not at all or not right now. She held up 2 fingers as in the second one, and he nodded. He yawned and said, all right, I work at a cafe during the week, though once school starts up I'll be going back to college for law enforcement. However, that's not for another 3 months, as I missed last semester, so I should be home from 3:00 onward, which is when we can go out and introduce you to the town, get you anything you need, and go shopping. Unless you'd rather wait for me here on days we aren't going out to do something. She blinked and asked, are you asking me out on a date? He laughed and shook his head, explaining that going out and doing things was part of the program to allow the Mamano girls to get used to Earth. She nodded and said, "All right, I get it." I was just confused as the girls at the palace said guys can be rather subtle when asking a princess out so as not to offend her. Then again, my older sister always said that she was proud of me for scaring away weaker males. Izuku blinked and said, "Your family really values strength, don't they?" She nodded and he sighed, muttering, "No wonder you keep pushing my buttons." She hummed and he said, "Nothing, just talking to myself. If you want, we can watch something on TV or we can go out into town and I can show you the local shops. Do you have all the clothes you need?" She nodded and he smiled, saying, "Great. That means that we don't have to go shopping in the interspecies department for clothing just yet." She shook her head, chuckling, and said, "Just because I don't need clothing doesn't mean I wouldn't like to see the styles." He sighed and muttered about "there goes the day." She smirked and said, "Is the big bad cafe worker afraid of shopping with little old me?" He snorted and shook his head. She smirked and said, "Good, then you won't mind if we go when I'm finished eating." He shrugged and said, "If that's what you want, Ryuko. I know many women would prefer to wait till they're settled in to look at the trends, but you are royalty, so maybe you're just a bit more high maintenance." She glared and he smirked at her, happy with his successful dig at her upbringing. He continued, "Of course, if you just want to explore the town, I can't exactly deny you as a responsible host." Ryuko snorted and said, "You're lucky you're cute and these damn laws prevent Mamano from showing you your place." He snorted and stared at her challengingly, making her smirk. He raised an eyebrow and she said, "I like the fire in your eyes." He laughed at that and she said, "I'm glad you find that amusing, as though I'm no hellhound. I'll gladly show you your place in the pecking order is below a dragon." Izuku snorted and said, "My place is not beneath anyone. At worst I'm in charge, at best we're equals. Don't think just because you're a dragon I'll let you do whatever you want, nor will I let you badmouth my kind." She said, "You realize my mother's consort is a human right." He blinked and shook his head. She sighed and explained, "There are no male Mamano. It's why some call us monster girls. We generally give birth to females of our species. I've yet to hear of a male being born between a Mamano and a human. Sadly, it may lead to extinction of our species if we turn all human females on Earth into Mamano, as we did the females on our home world without really trying. Though Earth humans are somewhat resistant to our auras, thankfully. Still, though, with enough exposure, even the strongest of human females will become a Mamano in time. It's rather sad, really, because unless the demon lord can find a consort who can supply enough mana, humanity and Mamano are going to both go extinct. After all, if a Mamano turns women into Mamano and only births Mamano girls, then what does that mean when the male humans all pass away? Izuku blinked and said, "Seriously?" She nodded and he said, "Holy shit, no wonder your kind are having trouble coming through the portal. It's to limit the amount of your aura in the air." She nodded yet again and he said, "That explains so much. What exactly spreads your aura, though?" She snorted and said, "The very thing the program forbids." Izuku blinked and said, "Fighting." She laughed and said, "No, Mr. Midoriya, spreads our aura. It's why we usually send children and single mothers who have gone past the problem of needing a mate. However, we are becoming desperate for more males. Thus, more of us are coming through of marriageable age. Other than that, most of us are just content to explore your world. Of course, that's not counting the undead who, like your friend Zimbina, can't have children but still release a low-level aura, or a higher aura in the throes of climax." Izuku swallowed loudly and said, "Christ almighty, wait, can zombies turn males into zombies?" She shook her head and he said, "Oh, wonderful. Anyway, if you're ready, we can head out." She finished up her katsudon, then Izuku put their plates in the sink and escorted her to the door. She walked alongside him, her wings folded, then yawned and stretched her arms over her head. He asked, "Want to take a nap first?" She shook her head and he said, "Okay, if you're sure." She nodded. He led her outside and they started walking down the street. He pointed out shops, houses, high rises, etc. They were in an underdeveloped part of Tokyo that was more residential than business, but it had its own charm. He led her to the local store for Mamano and they entered. She immediately started browsing the shelves and racks of clothes while he waited at a bench by the changing rooms. She hummed softly to herself as she browsed, noticing another extra species was sharing the racks with her. She said, "Hello, I'm Ryuko Tatsuma, but my friends call me Ryukyu." The girl turned toward her showing her antlers and said, "Hi, I'm Amanda Lee. I'm a dear girl and my friends call my Ames or Manda. Nice to meet you. Did you come to shop or browse? I'm doing a little of both myself." Ryukyu said, "A little more of the latter, but if I find something good I'll do the former. I'm here with my host. He's over by the changing rooms. What about you?" Ames smirked and said, "I'm here with my host too. She's currently at the register waiting for me to show up with anything I want to buy. She's a great girl but a little cautious, doesn't much like men because of some bad ones in her old school when she was a kid. Don't blame her for it, but I'm partly her to find a mate. What about you, Miss Ryuko?" Ryuko smiled and said, "Call me Ryukyu, Amanda. I'm here for the same reason as you. The pickings on our home are too slim. All the good ones are already taken. Although I think my host is a pretty okay guy. He has a backbone at least. He's also asked me if I had any dietary needs. I was rather surprised by that." Amanda nodded and said, "My host, Rieko Yanagi, asked me the same thing the first day. I told her I was a herbivore and she just rolled with it like, 'All right, girl, I got you,' though she was more verbose, saying, 'I understand and accept your needs. I will gladly provide you sustenance suiting your palate.' Surprised me, but you get used to her verbose way of speaking pretty quick. She's got an obsession with the dark and spooky things. She scared the crap out of me with a few horror movies, even though I know undead are a thing back home." Ryuko chuckled and said, "I don't know my host that well, although my coordinator seems to think he's a good guy. He also does the local Moan unit's laundry for them, so he can't be all bad. I'd think he was a pushover if he didn't push back when I push his buttons. Anyway, what kind of clothes you looking for?" Amanda said, "I'm mainly looking for summer wear. All my fur is rather hot this time of year. I shed, but it doesn't help as much as it could. It was different in the forest, but this place has more heat because of the asphalt and concrete. Anyway, I found what I want. Maybe I'll see you around, Ryukyu. Later." Ryuko said later, then went back to browsing the clothes. She picked a few tops specifically made with winged species in mind, then walked to the changing rooms. Izuku looked bored out of his mind but smiled, and she said, "I found some things I want to try on." He nodded and told her to go ahead. She walked into the changing room and changed her top for one that was light blue, sleeveless, and had a heart on the front. She walked out and asked, "How's it look?" He hummed and gave her a thumbs up. She smiled slightly and said, "Thanks." She changed it for a red top that had sleeves but a completely open back. She walked out spreading her wings, and he said, "Is that an open back shirt?" She nodded and he said, "The first one had slits for your wings, right?" She nodded and he said, "It brings out the slight pink tint to your scales." She blinked and looked at the scales on her shoulders, seeing that yes, they did have a slight pink tint to them. She hummed and changed yet again. This time she walked out in a green top that showed her stomach and wrapped around her wings. Izuku hummed and said, "I like this one the best, but I'm partial to green." She walked back into the room, changing back into her regular top, then picked up all three and carried them to the checkout counter. Izuku walked up beside her and she hummed. He glanced at her as she paid. Then the two of them left the store and went to a nearby ice cream parlor to get some ice cream. Izuku got a mint chocolate chip cone, and Ryuko got a double scoop of strawberry. They walked around while eating their ice cream, then, as it started to get a little later in the day, headed home. As soon as they got home, Izuku stretched out and threw away his ice cream wrapper, then plopped on the couch, turning on the TV. Ryuko took her purchases to her room and decided to take a nap. Little did either know, this was the start of Izuku Midoriya's monster girl harem and life. It was the second day of Ryuko hanging out at Izuku's, and so far the day had started off rather boring. Izuku had gotten up early, made breakfast for his house guest, and put it in the microwave, then walked to his job at the cafe. He walked in and saw his coworkers, a succubus named Amelia Hart, a rabbit girl named Liona Cross, two men named Marcus Smith and Nagi Uzugami, and a centaur named Liz Sora. He waved at them, and Liz said, "Dekun." He laughed, realizing the nickname Ka-chan gave him was at least useful after being turned around. He smiled at Liz, who galloped over and hugged him, picking him up off the ground. Amelia was, as usual, waiting tables alongside Marcus. Nagi was working in the back cooking, and Liona had been sharing the counter with Liz, who left her spot to hug Izuku as mentioned before. He coughed and said, "What's up, Liz?" She giggled and pet his head like one would pet their bunny, and he growled, "I am not a rabbit. You don't even treat Liona like this, and she's an actual bunny girl. Speaking of said bunny girl, how you doing, Liona?" Liona giggled and said, "Hey, bunny bro. I'm doing good. My homestay is happy I'm bringing in an income, and he's going to check up on me today. I know Amelia lives with the owners, but you'd think that more people would have a problem with the mamano in this shop." Izuku laughed at that, thinking she underestimated the love of otaku for animal girls. Liz said, "I heard you joined the program. What's your guest like?" Izuku sighed and said, "Difficult. She's a royal dragon." That got the three Mamano girls to gasp. He chuckled and said, "The only real difficulty is she's constantly challenging me for some reason. Other than that, she's a normal 20-something-year-old, I'd assume, if she's even in her 20s. Hard to tell with those with reptilian bodies. I know I'm 19, but this is my second year of college, so I at least can start interning with law enforcement. Anyway, Liz let go of me so I can start washing the dishes." Liz pouted and set him down. He chuckled and said, "I thought you had a crush on your homestay host." She mumbled something sounding like, "I found out he's gay," making Izuku blink and say, "Could you repeat that, Liz?" She sighed and said softly, "I said he's gay. He's not interested in me. I even kind of scare him as I'm a dairy centaur." He wondered why until she glanced down at her chest. He stared at her and she said, "Yes, he's afraid of S." Izuku resisted the urge to laugh, knowing that there was probably a good reason for such a fear, and stroked Liz's flank, sighing. She smiled and said, "Thanks, Deku-kun. I know you can always cheer me up." I asked him if he'd like me to apply for a new host, but he said, and I quote, "I can handle you having a large chest, but only because I see you as a sister. If you start flirting with me, we can't live together any longer, all right?" I agreed, and we've been relaxed ever since. He's also tried to set me up with other guys who are more into girls with big assets, but most of them are afraid of my horse half. Izuku studied Liz's body and wondered why they didn't like her. She was a quarter horse with a black and white body, making her a paint horse. Her hair, in contrast, was a vibrant crimson, her eyes were purple, and her chest had to be at least an E-cup. Izuku shook those thoughts away and focused on the rest of his coworkers as he started for the back, calling out to Liz and saying, "You'll find the right guy, Liz. There's plenty of fish in the sea after all, and plenty of guys on the streets." The first one he focused on as he headed to the back was Miss Hart. She had long black hair, dark red skin, a spade-tipped tail, bat wings, horns, green eyes, a D-cup chest, and was wearing a spaghetti strap top and a brown skirt. On her feet, she was wearing a pair of 2-inch heels. Without the heels, she was 5'4". With them, she was 5'6". Behind the counter was Liona, a light-skinned girl with black rabbit ears, a black rabbit tail, black furred rabbit legs, a C-cup chest, brown doe eyes, a nice smile, and was wearing jeans, a band t-shirt for the band ANM8, and had a shoulder bag. She was pretty short at 5 foot even. Nagi was a brown-eyed, black-haired young man with pale skin, a black t-shirt, cargo shorts, sneakers, and stood 5'7" tall. Marcus was a 6-foot-tall, brown-haired, blue-eyed man. He had a tattoo of an Eastern dragon wrapped around his left arm, wore a watch, sneakers, jeans, a t-shirt, a jean jacket that hid all but the head of his tattoo, and sunglasses. Izuku finally made it to the back and started doing the dishes as the morning crowd filed in. He hummed to himself as he worked, finding it relaxing. Times like this made him glad he curbed his muttering habit. Otherwise, he'd be talking up a storm to himself. After washing the dishes, he took a turn at the stove while Nagi took a break. Izuku glanced at the orders, then said, "Hey, Amelia, I have your order for table 3 done." Amelia walked back and took it from him, smiling and kissing his cheek, making him chuckle. Amelia was always affectionate, but it was just her nature as a succubus, or so Izuku thought. What Izuku didn't realize was that the other guys weren't given nearly as many cheek pecks, hugs, or as much affection as him, because she liked teasing him and she liked him as a person. He'd been one of the first to ask her about her abilities with excitement, as well as protecting her from harassing customers since he'd started working there. Hell, all the Mamano girls at the cafe liked Zuku as she thought of him. He was sweet, saw them as friends rather than pieces of hot tail, was polite, kind, and was very protective. The owners also liked the boy and constantly teased her about her crush on him, not that she'd admit such was the case. It didn't help Izuku was an accidental flirt. She thought about how he would end up being adored by her cousin Kayama Nimuri as she took the plate from Izuku and went to table 3. She knew that Kayama was still in Iascha, the world of the Mamano, but she figured the young adult succubus would love to come and be Izuku's home stay if she heard about him. She'd probably also try to corrupt him into a pervert and would most likely fail. She shook her head and told her table's guests, "Thank you for coming to the Dove Wing Cafe. I've brought your order, which was cooked by one of our staff. I believe you ordered a pair of rice bowls." At their nods, she set the rice bowls down and told them enjoy. After a few minutes of making sure they didn't need anything else, she walked to the counter to talk to Liz and Liona. The bunny and centaur looked at her questioningly, and she said, "Hello, girls. We have any new customers that need to be seated, or can I head to the back and bug Izuku?" They glared at the last part, and she said, "Kidding, kidding. I know he and Nagi are going to be busy cooking, so I don't want to distract. Anyway, we need to talk about how you two seem to have eyes for my Izuku. Liona, I thought you were dating your next-door neighbor, and I heard about your host Liz. But why do I get the feeling that Izuku's nice attitude just made you want him? Also, you are lactating." Liz looked down and saw that yes, she was lactating, making her swear and cover her chest. This was the problem with being a dairy anything. She had a cousin who was a hall store or dairy minotaur on her dad's side. Her dad's brother married a hall store, and their daughter was working at a farm as a dairy girl. Of course, her mother owned her own farm where she milked herself and had her father help. Her 2 older sisters also got milked on the farm. Their milk wasn't quite as nutritious as that of a hall store, but it was good for those that couldn't have cow milk. It was the export of their farm along with a few chicken harpy eggs from her dad's other bride and daughters, and they were all managed by his Kametachi wives. The 3 were currently pregnant with triplets each, and Dad was working himself ragged. The eldest of his 3 Kametachi wives was the manager of the farm, the middle sister was in charge of finances, and the youngest of the 3 was in charge of making sure that the actual animals on the farm were taken care of. Liz sighed and muttered, "I wish I wasn't a dairy centaur." Liona patted the centaur's human back and consoled her. Amelia blushed and said, "Sorry to make you feel bad, Liz. I just thought you should know you're lactating. Also, if any of us want a chance with Izuku, we're going to have to get through his Dragon House guest. We all know he's a hunk with a cute face, so it'll take no time for him to prove himself worthy of a dragon's love. However, I'd rather not let her be queen of his harem unless it was an equal partnership. Plus, most dragons go back to the continent of Dragonia on Iascha whenever they find a good match. I'd rather not lose Izuku to the dragon families before I can even prove that I'm not just a flirt." The other 2 nodded at that and thought about how it would suck for Izuku to quit or even move to Iascha without telling him that they might, possibly, maybe have feeling for him because he's such a great guy. They'd rather he worked for Moan than go to Iascha with the dragon royalty he was living with. Izuku, meanwhile, knew none of this as he cleaned up the grill and traded places with Nagi, then started washing the pots, pans, wok, knives, and other utensils that he hadn't gotten to before manning the kitchen's cooking implements. He was thinking about Ryuko and how he could make her feel more at home rather than feeling like she was stuck with him and prove he'd like to be friends, as well as prove that he was no pushover. He knew part of why she pushed him so hard was her nature. The other part was how fit he looked, and maybe a third part was the fact that dragon tribes were matriarchal. He felt she may think she needed to be in charge or she'd be looked down on by her family. He yawned as he finished cleaning, then Amelia walked back and said, "Izuku, think you can help us out front?" He readily agreed and stretched, then walked out front and grabbed a notepad before walking up to the counter, and Amelia said, "Tables 6 and 7 need a waiter. I've got tables 3 and 4, and Liona has tables 5 and 8. It was standard procedure for each server to only have 2 tables while 1 person worked the counter and 2 ran the back. Of course, on a busy day, all 10 tables would be in use, meaning 5 servers and 1 in the back, though on those days they'd usually call in someone who was off to man the register. Izuku walked to table 7, which was a group of high school girls who were all smiles, and put on his best smile, saying, "Hello, ladies, I'm Izuku Midoriya, and I'll be your waiter today. What can I get you to drink?" He saw the menus in front of them, so he didn't ask if he could get them a menu, and waited patiently for their orders. The leader of the 4, a brunette with a bob cut, brown eyes, a badge on her uniform, and a black hair tie on her wrist, said, "Hi, Izuku. I would like a lemon tea." He quickly wrote that down. The girl to her left, a blue-haired, red-eyed girl with a ponytail and her uniform's top button unbuttoned, said, "A blueberry smoothie, please." The girl across from the blue-haired girl had gold eyes, black hair, and cat ears on her head, saying, "Oolong tea, please." Her uniform was immaculate, and she had her back over her left shoulder with a book sticking out. The final girl had blonde hair, green eyes, her uniform unbuttoned, revealing her undershirt, which was black, a loose side ponytail, a slight glimmer of challenge in her eyes, and her bag at her feet said, "One caramel macchiato with extra sugar and whipped cream, as well as a chocolate drizzle, and some coffee beans in the cream." Izuku wrote down their orders and said, "Can I have you lovely ladies' names, please? I don't want to merely call you by your hair color, though you all look as though you take care of your hair and appearance without any problems, so I doubt you'd mind me complimenting you on it. But I like being personable with my customers. I like knowing their names so I can memorize in case they come in again, and I can remember their orders." The girls blinked, and the brunette said, "I'm Kinoko Kamari. The girl with black hair is Blake Belladonna Nekamata. The blue-haired girl is Saya Kinjaro, and the blonde is Natalie Blaze. We're all students at a local all-girl private school called Tsunemori Academy. We're in a bit of a hurry cause it's lunch time, and we have to be back at school in 45 minutes, so could you put a rush on our order?" Izuku asked, "Just drinks, or do you know what you want to eat too?" Kinoko smiled and said, "I'll have the mushroom dumplings." Blake said, "I'll have a tuna sandwich." Saya said, "Cold soba, please." Natalie said, "A cheeseburger with pickles, mustard, ketchup, no mayo, and a side of fries." Izuku wrote down their orders and said, "So for Kinoko, I've got a lemon tea with our mushroom dumplings. For Blake, a tuna sandwich and oolong tea. For Saya, cold soba and a blueberry smoothie. And last but certainly not least for the rocking out Miss Natalie, a cheeseburger with pickles, mustard, ketchup, hold the mayo, a side of fries and a caramel macchiato with extra chocolate sauce, whipped cream, topped with coffee beans and mixed with extra sugar. Is that everything?" The girls nodded, and he said, "That's also a rush order, so I'll have it out as soon as it's coked. Our chef usually has a little of everything started since we're a diner cafe, and if he needs extra help, I can have one of my coworkers bring your drinks while I get your food finished by helping him out." The girls thanked him, and he walked to the back delivering their food order, then handed their drink order to Liz, who quickly got to work when Izuku said, "I got a rush order for 4 students, Liz." They were used to working on students' time, so she got to work quickly. After making sure Nagi didn't need help, he walked to table 6, which was a pair of businessmen sipping water, and put on the same smile he gave the girls, then said, "Hello, gentlemen. If I remember correct, you're Toshiro Yagi and Hirohito Kana. Would you like your usuals?" Toshiro and Hirohito nodded, saying, "Of course, Izuku." Hirohito said, "I want an American breakfast with a black coffee, my friend." Meanwhile, Toshiro said, "As always, I'd like a glass of orange juice and a small stack of pancakes with maple syrup and a side of bacon." Izuku smiled and said, "Of course, gentlemen. The kitchen's a little backed up with a rush order, but it should only take a minute or two to get your drinks. I believe your breakfast will be out in about 10 minutes max. If it's not, I'll personally go to the back and get started on your order, as Nagi may be a little backed up as we have a rush order for a table of 4. They thanked him for his concern, and he walked up to Liz saying, "1 black coffee and a pitcher of orange juice with a frozen glass, Liz." She handed him the orders, then he said, "I'll be right back for table 7's orders." He passed by table 7 saying, "I'll be right back with your drinks, girls, then. While I run table 6's order into the kitchen, I'll check up on your food." The girls thanked him for the heads up, then he put table 6's drinks down and headed back to the counter to grab the girls' drink orders. He checked up with Nagi, who said table 7's order would be ready in another 2 minutes. Then he could get started on table 6's American breakfast, pancakes, and bacon. Izuku took the girls their drinks, then said, "Your food will be right out." Lina stared and said to Amelia, "The boy is a machine, I swear." The succubus laughed, and she said, "I'm serious, he remembers everyone's orders based on their looks, forces us all to work faster, and treats it like he has to handle everything himself." By the old gods, Zuko is a force to be reckoned with. You'd think he was a general who had to keep track of his army and their needs. Amelia chuckled and said, I get what you're saying, Lyanna, I do. However, he just wants to do his best. I swear you act like he memorizes every customer and not just regulars. He forgets people between each time they come in and just remembers them based on their appearance. I bet if those girls were to come in for the dinner rush in casual clothes, he wouldn't recognize them. Lyanna smirked, and Amelia said, Let me guess you'll take that bet, Lyanna. Lyanna nodded, and Amelia said the usual. Lyanna nodded, saying, Loser has to avoid talking to Izuku outside of work interactions, and as also has to take the winner's shift on a day Izuku is off even if they're off the same day. Amelia sighed and nodded, then they shook on it and got back to work. Izuku, meanwhile, carried the girls' food to their table. He said mushroom dumplings for Kinoko, a tuna sandwich for Blake, for Say a cold soba, and last but not least for Miss Natalie a burger with mustard, ketchup, pickles, no mayo, and a side of fries. Enjoy. They thanked him and dug in as he went to get table 6's order and dropped it off, then went to stand by the counter waiting to see if anyone needed anything. Liz said, Relax, Deku-kun. You really put the can do it. I know it's supposed to be Dekaru, but you said you prefer Deku, so Deku it is. Izuku nodded, smiling and relaxing while the girls went to and from their tables. Marcus walked up. Liz said, Need another refill for table 2, Smith. Marcus nodded, and Liz filled up the 4 cups with their soda of choice before Marcus took them back to table 2 and checked up on table 1. Izuku watched his table and noticed the girls were almost done, so he had Liz prepare to write up their check, then walked over. He asked, Was everything to your liking, ladies? They nodded, and he asked, Will this be one check or separate? The girls said separate, and he walked back to Liz to get their receipts, making a note to ask before he served next time, because he usually did, but he was just so interested in the new customers he forgot his table etiquette. He got their checks and walked back saying, Here you go, ladies. They quickly paid, and he thanked them especially cause each left a $5 tip amounting to a not-so-small $20 tip. He pocketed his tip, then walked back to Liz and handed her $2 before handing another 3 to Nagi. It left him $15, but he always shared his tips with the cashier and chef. He didn't have to, but the people appreciated it, and he wasn't losing much by being giving. Lyanna walked up to him, and he told her to hold on, then refilled both of table 6's cups before walking back and asking, What's up, Lyanna? She smirked and said, I was wondering if you would be willing to spar at the gym on Sunday. Unless you plan on sparring with Polt, the kobold you normally deal with at the gym. Izuku blinked and said, You know Polt is planning on opening up her own interspecies gym, right? Lyanna blinked and he said, Seriously, I only know cause she told me last week when we sparred in a boxing match. So she won't be at the gym for a while. Thus, if you want, I can definitely spar with you. I figure you want another kickboxing match. At Lyanna's nod, he said, Great. I'll bring Ryuko with me and she can work out while we spar. Lyanna hummed and said, Ryuko's your dragon home stay. He nodded, then held up a hand to tell her to wait, which she nodded, and they both went back to their tables to refill the cups of their patrons and take away their dirty dishes. Izuku thanked Hirohito and Toshiro. Toshiro said, You go to the gym a lot, right, Izuku? At his nod, he said, Maybe you know my brother. His name is Toshinori. He's a boxer who just came back from America due to an injury. He goes to the local gym as an instructor. Izuku hummed and then snapped, saying, I know Toshinori. He's dating my mom. They got together when she started working out at my recommendation. Honestly, I was surprised. My mom's homestay sees him as a father figure, and I don't know him that well, but he calls me Midoriya Shounen. Are you his older or younger brother? Toshiro said, I'm the baby of the family. I was wondering why he was planning on moving out. Thanks for letting me know he found someone. If you need help with your boxing, let me know, and I'll tell him to help you out, if your mother hasn't already done so. He chuckled and thanked the man, then took their dishes to the back and started doing the dishes, as it was a slow period of the day. After washing the dishes, he met up with Lyanna and said, Did you know that Toshiro's brother is dating my mom? Lyanna blinked and asked, Really? He nodded and said, Yup. He's also my boxing instructor. I thought I knew a few Yagas, I just didn't remember where I'd heard his name from before until Toshiro told me they were related. Anyway, we're still on for Sunday if you're off. The rest of the day passed uneventfully with Izuku talking to both Mark, Nagi, and the three Mamano girls. He recognized the girls from the lunch hour and quickly greeted them asking if they wanted the same as that morning, then getting them their new orders. After that, he headed home where Ryuko was bored out of her mind watching TV. She saw him come through the door and said imperiously, "Entertain me, Izuku." He chuckled and challenged her to a game of Smash. They played for a few hours, then he made dinner and they sat down to eat while watching a concert performed by ANM8. After the concert, the two went to bed and washed up, not in that order obviously. The following day, while Izuku was at work, Ryuko was studying the rules of the ICEP. After studying for 3 hours, she had lunch, played a few games on the consoles Izuku had, watched some TV, and just constantly tried to fight boredom. All this was the same as the day before. The only difference was the things she saw on TV. She got hooked on a Korean drama and was binge-watching it when Izuku arrived home. He chuckled and said, "Wouldn't have taken you for a Korean drama fan." She ignored him watching the show with rapt attention. He chuckled and sat at the kitchen table going over his cash and putting some away. After another 2 hours, he started dinner while Ryuko turned off the drama and rubbed her eyes, which were sore from being open so long. She turned to Izuku and asked, "When did you get home?" He looked at the clock saying, 2 hours ago. "I left you alone after saying I wouldn't have taken you for a fan of Korean dramas." She flushed and he said, "Don't worry, there's nothing wrong with liking Korean dramas. I'm a bit of an anime nerd myself. I also love me some cop shows." She chuckled and said, "The guy who wants to be a cop loves cop shows, ironic." He flushed and chuckled along with her. After that, he finished dinner and they dug in, then watched the news. About an hour into the news, Izuku's cell rang. He glanced at the caller ID and saw it was his mom. He got up to take it and handed Ryuko the remote. She started channel surfing while he talked to his mother. He said, "Hey, Mom." Inko replied, "Hey, sweetie, Yagi, Veronica, and Kiara say hi." He chuckled and told her to tell them he said hi back. Inko said, "I know you missed the winter semester, but you plan on going back to school in the fall, right?" He replied, "Yeah. I'm on my second year, so I can intern with Moan or a government agency and see which branch of law enforcement I want to work in." Inko laughed and said, "We both know you want to work for Moan. You are good friends with the local squad in your area after all." Izuku chuckled and agreed with her. She said, Kiara was wondering if she could visit next week when you're off work." Izuku thought about the Chimera girl and all of her personalities. He shivered as he remembered each of her 5 personalities claimed him as their husband. He said, "Which personality is in control right now, Mom? Dragon, lion, goat, snake, or wolf?" Inko's smile could be heard as she said, "Wolf, honey. She's loyal as can be right now, calm, challenging toward any other females and protective. She even snapped at Yagi for not announcing his presence before coming in tonight." He chuckled and said, "The first personality to latch onto me, huh?" Inko chuckled as well and replied a simple yep. Then he said, "Sure, she can come in next week. I'll be busy this weekend with my home stay and someone from work challenged me to a kickboxing match. Think Tashinori can referee." She told Izuku to hold on while she asked him, then said, "He said sure. He needs to visit his brother this weekend anyway, and he has to get more of his stuff to move in. And since his brother lives only a block from the gym, he'll meet you, your home stay, and your opponent there." He thanked her and they talked for another half hour about work, Kiara, Tashinori, and how Izuku met his brother at work and found out they were brothers. Then he told her about how he was trying to get to know his home stay. After that, they hung up and Izuku plopped on the couch, Ryuko leaning against the armrest across from him, and they watched a baseball game. Izuku said, "You know, you keep saying you want to fight me, right?" She nodded and he said, "How about a mixed martial arts match?" Ryuko blinked and asked, "Oh, what do you have in mind?" Izuku said, "A MMA match in my gym this Sunday. We can go before I spar with my coworker. If I win, you stop acting like I am beneath you unless you feel like being nice at the time. And if you win, I accept that you're in charge and stop fighting you until I win. I'll also throw in getting you a permit to go out by yourself as fast as possible if I lose. If I win, however, you have to be a model citizen and loose the 'I'm too proud to deal with these pesky mortals' attitude behind." You also can't treat my mom's homestay like she's dirt. I know how dragons look on other Mamano, especially chimeras. She blinked and said, "You're allowing a chimera into our home." He nodded and she said, "When I win you will tell your mother that abomination isn't allowed anywhere near me. I refuse to speak to such abominations." Izuku growled and she said, "Oh, did I hit a nerve? Why? It's not like you grew up with her or anything." He said, "She moved in with me and my mother when I was 12. She was 13, and she instantly attached herself to me. I refuse to let anyone treat her like she's a monster just because she's a combination of 5 races." Ryuko glared and he said, "Now I'm looking forward to kicking your ass." She smirked, liking his fire, and thought to herself, "Oh, Izuku, if you prove to be a worthy mate, then I don't care how many concubines you have or what race they are. However, until you win, I will control you and teach you to behave like a proper pet." Little did she realize she picked at a sleeping wolf pretending to be a bunny. Izuku glared at her and thought, "All right, Ryuko, I guess I'll have to teach you a lesson. No one tells me I can't hang out with my family, nor do they insult my family. Ka-chan learned that the hard way, and I guess you'll have to too." The rest of the week passed by uneventfully until finally it was Sunday. Izuku led Ryuko to his gym and saw Yagi standing by the door alongside Liona. He said, "Hey Toshinori, Liona, I know I originally was just going to spar with Liona in a classic kickboxing match, but I need Yagi to watch a MMA match between me and my home stay first. After I kick her ass, we can have our match." Ryuko said, "He means after he wakes back up from the infirmary, he will gladly take you on, Bunny Girl. I have a score to settle with him. He thinks he can talk back to a dragon of my caliber." Izuku glared, and she said, "Whenever you are ready to referee Mr. Yagi, we will go to the ring." Toshinori sighed, seeing that there was no way out of this if the fire in both their eyes was anything to go by. Then he led them to the gym's boxing ring and said, "I hope you both know what you're doing. Izuku, your mother will kill me if you get hurt too badly, so try not to push yourself too hard." Izuku chuckled and changed into his sports gear, then started doing stretches. Ryuko, meanwhile, stretched out her limbs, flexed her body, and prepared to show the bunny why he was prey to the dragon. Izuku climbed into the ring when he was all loosened up, and Ryuko got in opposite him. Then he said, "Street rules, Yagi." Yagi blinked and he said, "I don't want her claiming I forced her to fight a certain way when she only knows how to brawl." Ryuko glared and said, "I was fine using the techniques my trainer taught me, but now you're asking for me to beat you into the ground like I'm fighting for my life. That means you are willing to accept the consequences of your challenge, right?" Izuku merely nodded and got into a loose stance while she spread her wings and lashed her tail out her tail behind her, saying, "Whenever you are ready, Yagi-san." Toshinori sighed and said, "On thee. 1, 2, 3, begin." Ryuko lunged at Izuku, who caught her arms and slammed her into the mat. She grabbed his leg and pulled him down, then climbed on top of him and punched him in the ribs. Izuku gasped and growled, then head-butted her, not thinking about the fact she had horns, doing more damage to himself than her. He pushed her off, wiping blood out of his eyes, and she wrapped her tail around his neck, then started slamming him into the mat over and over. He tried to pry the tail off his throat and coughed out with each hit. He grabbed the tip of her tail, causing her to release him and pull it away. Like Lamia, the tip of a dragon's tail was sensitive, but not to the same degree. It felt more like a fully body massage than a cause for orgasm. She growled and said, "Only MY consort may touch the tip of MY tail." He coughed and hacked, punching her between the wings and knocking the air from her lungs, saying, "I had to get out of your grip somehow, bitch." He kicked her upside the head as she turned on him, gasping for air. She grabbed his next punch and tried to twist his wrist, only for him to kick her in the side. She gasped, and he pulled her head down, kneeing her in the face as she lashed out with her tail to sweep his standing leg out from under him. He muttered, "What the hell is this, Cobra Kai?" He started to fall and landed on his hands, then kicked her in the chin. She jerked back and used her wings to take to the air. He growled and got back to his feet, saying, "Coward." She swooped down and pinned him, then started pummeling his face. He spat blood into her eyes, making her reel back, and kicked her onto her side, then grabbed her wing and twisted it. She screamed in pain, attracting attention from other gym-goers, but Yagi told them this was just a match and that the two were fighting for high stakes. They all accepted, although Polt, who was in for the day helping out a lizard girl, looked on in worry about her sparring buddy being so brutal. Ryuko wiped her eyes and said, "That was dirty." Izuku smirked and said, "So was flying." She glared and they rushed at each other, then locked hands and started trying to push each other onto their back. Ryuko went for a headbutt, but Izuku ducked his head and kneed her in the stomach, making her gasp, and then pushed her onto her back and jumped on top of her. He started punching her face hard, making her growl and try to bite his fist. He didn't let her, though, and pinned her shoulders with his knees. She breathed a flame into his eyes, blinding him, but he kept punching, knowing that she couldn't get out unless she did something drastic. Her tail slammed into his back, making him gasp and roll forward. She got to her feet and said, "Bastard." He snarled, and they lunged at each other, punching, kicking, headbutting, trading elbow and knee shots, and aiming for the vitals. Everyone was surprised to see a human holding his own against a dragon without a weapon, but they didn't know Izuku had trained his body to peak performance. They were used to his mock spars with Polt and Liana. This was the first anyone had seen him fight seriously, and many could see why Moan constantly bugged him, and even Tia said he could take on her sisters. Izuku jumped back as Ryuko lunged forward, and Liana said, "You can do itzuku." He smiled at her belief in him, then punched Ryuko in the throat, making her cough. She kneed him in the groin, gently though, as no Mamano wanted any man unable to reproduce. It was still enough to drop him to his knees, where he punched her in the thigh, giving her a Charlie horse. He slowly got to his feet, then slammed her head into his knee, her horns piercing his flesh but his kneecap cracking against her skull. She shook her head slowly, obviously slightly concussed but still rearing to go. Izuku growled and said, "Just give up, damn it. I don't like hurting you. I'm supposed to prevent others from hurting you as your host." She growled, feeling looked down upon, and said, "I don't need your protection. It's men who need protecting by Mamono." Izuku punched her and growled, "Protecting from what? We only fight each other on Earth. There are no monsters, no rogue gods, no creatures that will kill men. I need to protect you from assholes who will attack you for your looks, your attitude, and just because you're female." She yelled, "I don't need protection, damn it. Stop looking down on me." Izuku kicked her in the face as she glared at him, then she lunged and pinned him, punching him throughout his upper body and face. Izuku growled and grabbed her hands, then twisted her left arm behind her back and dislocated her shoulder by kicking her forward. He picked her up by her tail, which was no mean feat, mind you, as she weighed at least 220 pounds, and started slamming her into the mat over and over. She tried to get free, but he stepped on her back and dislocated her wings, then stomped her head into the mat. She laid there gasping for air and asked, "How are you so strong?" He smirked and stretched, then leaned on the ropes, watching her climb to her feet and pop her shoulder back into place. She glared and said, "I know men aren't weak. I know my mother spouting about my father needing to be protected from other Mamano who were jealous was wrong. But how are you so strong?" Izuku popped his neck and rubbed his bruised knuckles, saying, "I was trained by Mamano to fight Mamano. I just have the ability to ignore a lot of pain." "Are you giving up?" Ryuko shook her head, and they rushed at each other, trading blows yet again. Izuku realized the only way one of them was going to win was by knocking the other one out, and he planned on winning. He kicked her as hard as he could, then punched her 3 times in rapid succession before ending with a roundhouse kick. She fell to the floor and tried to get up, only for Izuku to slam her head into the mat and started to choke her out. She tried to wrap her tail around his neck, but he started to choke her tighter, making her struggle futilely. Yagi saw this and muttered, "Midoriya Shounen has won." Liana nodded, and everyone else watched as Ryuko slowly passed out her tail, slapping Izuku across the face but not breaking his concentration. Then she wrapped her tail around his neck and started squeezing, but before she could get it too tight, she passed out. Izuku got up and said, "Good fight, Ryuko. Can someone move her to the infirmary?" A pair of Oni, one blue, one red, carried the dragon to the infirmary. Then Izuku turned to Liana and said, "Ready for our match. I really need something to cool my blood." She nodded and hopped into the ring. Yagi asked, "This is just a friendly sparring match, correct?" They nodded, and he said, "All right, I'll count out points for hits. Begin." They started trading blows at a rapid pace, showing that Izuku was still raring to go even though he just choked out a dragon. After 20 minutes, Ryuko walked out as Izuku fell on his back and Liana leaned against the ropes. Ryuko waved at Izuku, who waved back wholeheartedly, then yawned and said, "Thanks for watching over us, Yagi. I'm going to hit the showers, then talk to Polt since I thought I saw her in the crowd." He got up and hopped out of the ring, then walked to the showers while Ryuko thought about how she'd been mastered. She smirked and thought, "I have found a strong mate. I guess I will be proud to have him as my king, not just my consort." She stretched and popped her spine, then asked Liona to help her pop her wings back into place. The wings were a lot more durable than those of most creature, so it just took a little work to get them back in place with nothing but a little soreness. She stretched and said, "Yagi-san, can you tell Mrs. Midoriya I'd like to court her son?" Toshinori asked, "Only if you tell me exactly what that fight was, young lady." Ryuko grinned and said, "Foreplay." Toshinori shivered at that, thinking, if that's what a dragon considers foreplay, I fear for Midoriya Shounen's life. Then again, I have heard that once a dragon picks a worthy mate, they tend to be very protective and loving. Also, there are all of our world's tales of dragons only being bested by a knight after defeating hundreds of them, so Inko will probably be happy she is watching Izuku's back. Ryuko smiled and said, "I see you understand." He nodded and she said, "I don't need to watch over my Izuku, it appears. He is strong enough to take me on at full strength. To protect him, I must get stronger." Toshinori snorted and said, "The boy has broken human limits. I doubt anyone needs to protect him." Polt blushed and apologized, saying, "Sorry, but Izuku's my best friend. I always want cuddles from him. Speaking of, do you want to join us on our morning runs?" Izuku laughed at how she just came out there and asked it, then stretched and pulled the meatloaf out of the oven. He set it in the middle of the table along with a bowl of mashed potatoes, rice, gravy, and small fish. All three dug in and Polt said, "This is amazing, Izuku." He chuckled and said, "I try, Polt, I try." She smiled and he said, "Remember your question from yesterday?" She blinked and cocked her head to the side like a curious puppy. He chuckled and said, "The one about me after the question about working at your gym." She blinked, then tentatively nodded. He said, "Well, I thought about it overnight, and I decided I want to court you and Ryuko. I'm on the market." Polt shot up, cheering, and cheered, "Yes, yes, 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 yes. I'm so happy." She sat down blushing and said, "Yes, I'll accept your courtship." Izuku laughed and hugged her, then kissed her cheek, making her blush, and her tail wagged so fast he feared it would fall off. She smiled and hugged him back, then said, "Are you sure?" He nodded, and she said, "But do you know Dragon Lady well enough to really want her as a mate?" We kobolds are always willing to share, as I've told you before, and I would love a home to come back to. But are you sure you can deal with more than one girl? Plus there's Lyra and Kiara." Izuku chuckled and said, "It's fine, Polt. I figure the ICEP will prepare me for taking care of more than one Mamano, and after that it shouldn't be hard to expand it to more than one wife, what with polygamy recently becoming legal." Yes, polygamy was legal, mainly because of how many Mamano were coming through and the growing number of females compared to males thanks to this influx. Also, there were many couples who fell in love with their Mamano guest, but couldn't marry them as of yet because of ICEP not allowing marriages, yet. They wanted a test case, but for now polygamy was the first step. After that, the three started talking about going on dates and whatnot. Eventually, Polt had to go home, but she promised to meet Izuku in the morning for their run. After Polt left, he and Ryuko got to know each other better. They found they both liked the color blue as a secondary color, though Ryuko preferred red and he preferred green. They both loved katsudon, fish, and pizza. They both were chocoholics. They both preferred to talk over fighting if at all possible, and they were both under 25. Things they couldn't agree on was that Ryuko was a heathen as she liked pineapple on pizza, their sense of humor, Izuku's fashion sense when it came to his own wardrobe, and their favorite animals. Ryuko preferred reptiles and Izuku preferred canines. They also couldn't agree on how adorable Polt was. Ryuko said she was nice, but Izuku called her adorable with a rack that could stop traffic. The rest of the week passed with them getting to know each other. Then on Saturday, Kiara arrived. Kiara grinned when Izuku opened the door and wrapped her snake tail around him, cuddling him. She shouted, "Ziyu, I missed you." He realized Lion was in control and just let her go and have her way with him. She dragged him to the couch and cuddled him until Dragon took control and said, "I smell dragon on you." He pointed at Ryuko, who was chilling in his recliner, and she said, "Oh right, you're home stay. I also heard from a certain kobold you're on the market. Is it true?" He nodded and she said, "Excellent, I'm putting my bid in now." He chuckled and said, "Of course, Kiara. I knew you wanted me as your mate since I was 13. I'm not dense." Meanwhile, all around the city girls were sneezing and wondering how someone so cute could be so dense. Kiara nodded and said, "Of course you're not Zoo. If you were dense, then I'd have had to beat it into you like Lyra did that I was interested. I just had to point out that you cheered me up like no other guy, and you were more than willing to keep doing it." He nodded, and Ryuko realized that this girl was totally fucking with him. Kiara added, "Also, you knew that all those girls were interested in Ka-chan or guys were interested in Lyra." Ryuko at that point realized that Izuku was only dense toward those who had feelings for him. Izuku said, "How about we go out to eat?" The girls agreed, and he led them to a nearby sushi restaurant. Then the three ordered a large meal. They ate and talked for hours, then went home and talked more. Ryuko learned a lot about Izuku's past from age 12 onward, and Kiara kept switching personalities. Izuku yawned as the day drew to a close and asked, "Staying the night, Kiara?" Kiara nodded, and he said, "Staying in my bed again." She nodded again, and he sighed. Then the three of them went to bed. The following day, Izuku and Ryuko went on their usual morning run with Polt, while Kiara slept in. When they got back, they saw Kiara cooking and took showers, then joined her in the kitchen. She'd prepared a traditional Japanese breakfast, and Izuku dug in with gusto. Ryuko dug in a little slower, and Kiara said, "Mama Inko taught me all sorts of things while you've been away. I think you'll like the new girl." Izuku asked Victoria. She nodded, and he asked what she like. Kiara said, "A little haughty, kind, compassionate, a little stuck up, and very high opinion of herself." Izuku hummed, and she said, "She's a vampire, so it's kind of to be expected." Izuku nodded, and the three decided to play some Smash until it was time for Kiara to head home. She could only stay over one night because Inko wanted her home by 7 on Sunday to help with Sunday dinner. At 6, Kiara called a cab and headed home. Then Izuku collapsed on the couch and said, "She's a handful." Ryuko nodded and climbed into his lap, then wrapped her tail around his waist and started sucking on his neck. He shivered and almost seemed to purr in pleasure. She smirked and said, "Ah, my wolfy purrs." He looked at her confused, and she said, "You're no bunny, you're a wolf. You're loyal, stand fast when challenged, have a mean bite, and can bark loud." He sighed and kissed her, then nibbled her ear, making her melt. He chuckled, and she said, "It's not funny, I don't know why that turns me to mush." He shrugged and wrapped his arms around her, then her wings opened, and he pulled her close, having them close behind him. He didn't know how she did that, and when asked, she just said, "Wing exercises." They watched a few movies like that, then Izuku gently pushed her off and said, "I'm going to bed, love, you can join me as long as you're somewhat dressed." She sighed, but nodded. Then they went to bed and curled up together. This time Ryuko was the big spoon as she wrapped her wings around both of them, and he kissed her neck, gently then kissed her lips and slipped off to sleep. She mumbled, "Not cool, Izu." The rest of the 2 months passed with them getting to know each other, going on dates, arguing with Smith, Izuku dating Polt, and lots of trips to the gym. Finally, the day their Lamia friend would show up arrived. The van pulled up in front of the house with Izuku, Smith, and Ryuko standing out front. The van opened up, revealing a red-scaled, red-haired, pink-cheeked Lamia. She slithered over and said shyly, "Hi there." Izuku grinned and said, "Hey, you must be Mia. It's great to meet you. I'm your host, Izuku, and this is your house sister, Ryuko." She waved at Ryuko shyly, then Izuku said, "Your scales are so beautiful, you must take good care of them, and your hair and eyes are so lustrous. I can run you a bath if you want." She blushed and said, "Thank you, and I would like a bath if you're willing to run me one." It was a long journey from the nest. Izuku nodded and led her upstairs to the bathroom while Smith turned to Ryuko, grinning. Ryuko sighed and said, "What are you so happy about?" Smith said, "I knew he'd hit it off with the new girl, but you don't seem jealous." Ryuko said, "She's terrified, he's just being nice, and I knew I'd have to share him. When are you going to tell him how you feel, though, Smith?" Smith blushed, and she smirked, feeling the small victory. Ryuko said, "Why haven't you been visiting? Do you trust us to follow the ICEP?" Smith said, "I left you two alone for the last 2 months, but now that you have another home stay, I'll be visiting every day. The only reason I haven't visited these last 2 months is because I know Izuku isn't going to do anything to get anyone deported, but even that cinnamon roll stud can't hold out against you two and Polt." I know you've slept in the same bed, but always clothed. Meanwhile, Mia sleeps naked. Ryuko sighed and said, good to know. Meanwhile, Izuku was escorting Mia to the bathroom. She was 20 feet long from head to tail tip, had gold eyes, red hair, reddish-pink scales on her cheeks and fins for ears, as well as D-cup S, and was wearing a T-shirt and skirt combo. He ran her a warm bath, then said, I hope you come to like it here, Mia. She smiled shyly, and he said, if you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know. I am here for all your needs. I think you'll like Ryuko. She's a really great person. He helped her undress, then walked out of the bathroom and walked downstairs. Mia rested in the bath, holding her heart, and said softly, I think I'm in love. She had seen Izuku's scarred exterior, cute face, and his helpful attitude had endeared him to her. She sighed and said, I just have to keep that dragon skank's hands off him. He will be my darling. She giggled to herself and closed her eyes, relaxing in the hot bath. Izuku, meanwhile, was cooking some eggs for breakfast for everyone. Ryuko shivered and muttered, I sense a challenge to my place as head of the household. She growled softly and said, staying for breakfast, Smith. Smith nodded, and the two walked inside, then walked into the kitchen to see house husband Mode Izuku. Smith smiled and said the girls were wondering if you could do their laundry again, Izuku. He nodded, and she said, I'll have them bring it over tonight. He nodded again and gave her a thumbs up, then finished cooking and walked to the stairs, calling up, MIA, breakfast is ready. The Lamia slithered down, her hair in a towel and her body covered by a robe. He smiled and said, glad you found a robe that fits, Mia. She smiled shyly and flashed him her boobs, making him just smile and cover her up. She grumbled silently in her head, then he said, do you have any dietary restrictions or anything? And do you have anything in particular you want to call me? Ryuko calls me Izu, Smith Izu-kun, Moan's agents call me Deku-kun, and Polt calls me Izuku. She said softly, is it all right if I call you darling? He nodded, grinning, and she said, thank you, darling. He chuckled and said it was no problem as long as it helped put her mind at ease. Then they all dug in. She said, darling, I like eggs. Most snakes eat lots of eggs, so if you make these for breakfast every day, I'll be happy, though I do prefer hard-boiled. I don't have any restrictions that I know of, but we may have to consult a doctor. Izuku nodded, making a note to consult a doctor about Ryuko's health too, since Mamano doctors were becoming a regular thing in the world. Izuku stretched and said, it looks like life's going to get a lot more complicated as time goes on. Ah, well, that's not a big deal. I doubt it'll get too complicated, and even if it does, I figure I'll meet all kinds of new people. He held up a glass of OJ and said, to good friends, new opportunities, and a bright future. The others cheered to that, and Izuku said, so everyone enjoying their meals. The girls all said that yes, they were enjoying, and then he asked Smith, want me to make some for the Moan girls? She nodded, and he started cooking again while Smith called Moan and told them she'd be bringing breakfast with her. They immediately told her to tell Izuku thank you for them, and she pouted. Smith said, why do they thank you and not me? Izuku shrugged and smiled while Ryuko and Mia snickered. Mia could tell both of these harlots were after her darling, but for now she'd play nice till she had to cut a bitch. Plus, she really felt she should get to know her darling better before assuming that one or the other of them would be able to get into his pants or even steal him away from her. Smith sighed and said, I guess when you're done I'll head out. Izuku, remember you have work tomorrow. He nodded and bid her farewell after he finished cooking again. He said, later, Smith, and I know I have work tomorrow. I'll see you later though, cause I know you have some things you want to go over with me. She nodded and bid him farewell, then Izuku sat back down planning for the future. Little did he know his next big thing would be helping those in need. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share, and do comments.